On that note, I want to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, Admiral James Stavridis. He's a retired United States Navy Admiral, the current Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and Chairman of the Board of the U.S. Naval Institute. While in the Navy, Admiral Stavridis served as the Commander, U.S. Southern Command, and Commander, U.S. European Command, and NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, the first Navy officer to have held those positions. Admiral Stavridis retired from the Navy in 2013 after 30 years of service and became Dean of the Fletcher School in the summer of 2013. Now, as many of you know, in July, the media widely reported that the Admiral was being vetted by the Clinton campaign as a possible vice presidential running mate, despite his comment that his name was too long for a bumper sticker. Admiral Stavridis, it's a great honor for me to introduce you. Admiral, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and Sandy, thank you for that very kind introduction. I am very happy to be in Santa Fe. I'm here because of my very good friend Lee Dirks, who's a member of this fine organization, and I also want to simply add my voice to those recognizing the various distinguished personages who are here, including, and I think this is a wonderful thing, 2 state senators, a Republican and a Democrat, who really work together to get things done. And I applaud that, as we all should. Sandy gave me a kind of a wildly over-the-top introduction there. People hear that, Supreme Allied Commander, and they think, they generally have 2 reactions. One is, wow, I thought you would be taller. What can I say? And the other one is, people often say, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a naval aviator? Why didn't you fly jets? Because I was a ship driver throughout my career. And, frankly, I really wanted to be a naval aviator, like Maverick and Goose and Top Gun. But I'd had a very traumatic experience when I was a young boy that made aviation really difficult for me. Anyway, what I thought I would do tonight is really take about 20 minutes in discussing the challenges we face in the world and what we ought to do about them. And then I'd like to just open it up, because above all, what I see here is a community of thought in this marvelous, unique city of Santa Fe. So perhaps in some questions and answers, we can work our way through some of these big issues. What I'd like to talk about is how security has failed us in the 20th century and so far in the 21st century. And I'm going to start by taking you back 100 years ago. This is World War I. And this is the graduating class from the French Military Academy at SFCIR. 1914, these young men graduate, and they swear they will go into battle wearing their white gloves. And they do. By 1918, everybody in this photograph is dead. Everybody. All destroyed in the First World War, which killed probably 40 million people, many of them buried in battlefields around Europe, where I served as Supreme Allied Commander. This is Verdun, where in a period of 1 year in battle, 500,000 casualties. Now, these kind of numbers stagger us today, and you would think coming out of World War I, the world would have learned a lesson. Nope. This is World War II. This is the Battle of Stalingrad, where in 6 months, 1 million casualties occur. 6 months, 1 million casualties. And as a security professional, that's what I am, I have to ask myself, well, what went wrong in 20th century security? And I would argue that our failure was this. We tried to create security by building walls. the Maginot Line, the Schlieffen Plan, the Iron Curtain, the Bamboo Curtain, and most iconically here, the Berlin Wall. Walls separate us, but they will not succeed in creating real security for us. And let me give you a practical example from the 21st century, which involves my own life. This, of course, is 9/11. This is the terrible day when the Twin Towers go down and a fully loaded jet hits the Pentagon. The red circle was my office. I watched the airplane hit the Pentagon. I was a newly selected one-star admiral. And as I stumbled out of the building in smoke and flame, I kind of asked myself, is this really happening? Because here I was, behind every wall you can imagine. I'm behind the walls of the Pentagon. I'm defended by the strongest military on earth. I'm in the capital of the richest country in the planet. Was I safe on that day? I had a 37-year career in the military. I saw combat many times. This was the closest I came to dying, behind every wall imaginable. So as we speak tonight, my thesis for us is that, as Sandy said, we had to think about how we can create security, not by building walls, I would argue, but by building bridges. So let's quickly walk through some of the challenges out there. One is this kind of violent extremism. This is a young man named Ali Sakir. He's a member of the Islamic State. In January of this year, he became famous globally. Why? Because he executed his mother, who was guilty of trying to convince him of leaving the Islamic State. This is the kind of violent extremism we associate with places kind of far away: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Let's bring it a little closer. This is Europe, small, peaceful country, Norway. Several years ago, this handsome young man, upper right, Anders Breivik, blows up the government house like blowing up the old executive office building where Ambassador Huddleston used to work on the NSC staff, kills 7. Then he takes high-powered weapons, goes to a small island off the coast of Oslo, and shoots execution-style 70 young Norwegians between the ages of 18 and 24 at what we would think of as boy state or girl state. Upper left, you see him apologizing in court. He was caught, tried, convicted. He's apologizing to the forces of right-wing nationalism in Europe for not having killed more people on that day. This, by the way, has nothing to do with Islam. And here in our own country, we see this kind of violent extremism. Here, a deranged young man, a racist, full of political venom, who kills innocent worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina. So this kind of violent extremism runs the gamut around the world, but we ought to really focus on this group called the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State. They're different, they're more dangerous, they're more concerning because of what you see in this image. One is their ability to advertise, to create a brand. 3 years ago, nobody in this room could have picked out that black flag from a lineup. Yet today, that black flag is the most downloaded image on the World Wide Web. And secondly, they're a money-making machine. They smuggle oil, they sell antiquities, they extort, they kidnap, and perhaps worst of all, they traffic for sexual slaves. This is a young American girl, Kyla Mueller, who was captured. She was highly idealistic. She went to work in a refugee camp in Syria and was captured by the Islamic State. She became the personal sex slave of the leader of the Islamic State, a man named Bakhtari. This letter is the last one she wrote to her mother before she died in captivity 2 years ago. The Islamic State sells females. This is a price list. As you can see, for a human female between 1 and 9 years of age, it's $170. 10 years to 20 years, $130, etc. The photograph at the bottom, these are young Yazidi women who have been sold into sexual slavery. This is a group that is dangerous for all the reasons I've articulated, but worst of all, they have a plan. It's to build a caliphate. Look at Spain. Now, I don't think Spain is going to be called Andalus anytime soon, but we ought to realize that when a group is this venal, this dangerous, this capable of raising funds, this business savvy, we ought to spend time thinking about them. So we ought to worry about them as we kind of look around the world. We also ought to worry about nations that operate somewhat outside the rules of international behavior. This is Iran. This missile is a Sahil 2. It has a range of 2,000 kilometers. The good news about Iran, of course, is that we have developed a diplomatic mechanism that I hope will prevent them from obtaining nuclear weapons. We'll know more about the success of that in a few years. But we ought to realize that the Iranians will continue to pursue this, which is, in green, the Persian Empire. The Iranians see themselves as a great power in the Middle East. On the right here is the flag of Iran. Next to it are the flags of Darius the Great and Cyrus the Magnificent. The Iranians view themselves in this context, and this Shia-Sunni conflict in this region will continue to challenge us. But at the end of the day, Iran is not the most dangerous nation in the world. It is North Korea. North Korea has a young, untested, highly emotional leader with a really bad haircut. And he's already got nuclear weapons, folks, and he can deliver them at range. So we ought to be spending more time thinking about North Korea and the challenges it presents. There are other countries we ought to worry about. Syria, we talk about quite a bit. And the meltdown in Syria, 400,000 dead, 14 million pushed across borders, has led to this. Waves of refugees, which are undermining our European colleagues and contributing to Brexit and other challenges that the Europeans face. We need to also recognize on the edges of Europe pressure that comes from Russia, which has invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. And this is a very sterile-looking map of Ukraine. Here's what Ukraine looks like today. It's a war. It's going on. There are 15,000 have been killed thus far. And the challenge we face is that the strategic terrain in this war is not on this map. The strategic terrain in Ukraine is right there. It's Vladimir Putin. And understanding how we can find a way to work with his very challenging personality will be on the agenda of the next president. So those nations, I think, are part of the challenges we face alongside violent extremism. We also ought to worry about things like this. What crop is this? Poppies, right? Afghanistan, 90% of the world's heroin comes from this part of the world. And I would argue we ought to kind of park the moral question of drug use. Personally, I'm unconcerned if people choose to smoke marijuana, use heroin, or use cocaine. But what I worry about is the money, the profit that comes out of this, which undermines very fragile democracies. And it is not just in Afghanistan. It's here in the Americas. This is cocaine. This is actually a very hopeful picture. This is a photograph of a cocaine bust at sea. This is a high-tech U.S. Navy vessel That's capturing a Colombian drug runner loaded with cocaine. That's the good news. The bad news is that the high-tech U.S. Navy vessel is the one on top in the photograph. The thing on the bottom that looks like Batman's submarine, that was built in the jungle of Colombia. And when we caught it, and truth in advertising, there's a Navy destroyer just outside the picture. When we caught this thing, it had 10 tons of cocaine. 10 tons of cocaine in the hold of this submarine. Let me give you those numbers. Many of you come from a business and finance background. This submarine cost $1 million to build. The cocaine was $3 million as it was processed in Colombia. About $1 million in bribes and carrying costs. That's $5 million in. Street value, 10 tons of cocaine, $150 million. $5 million in, $150 million out. That is margin. That's profit. If you went to business school, that's EBITDA. And this is part of the challenge and the backdrop to the international world. We also ought to worry about what's going on in Asia. This is a terrific book. I highly recommend it. Robert Kaplan, Asia's Cauldron, about the bubbling world in the South China Sea, where China is rising. That's a natural phenomena. But as an international system, we have to understand how to integrate them effectively in the security world. Having come through all that geopolitics, we ought to recognize that Ebola on the top and Zika on the bottom, pandemics are enormous challenges. Let me take you back again 100 years ago, 1918, roughly 100 years ago, Spanish influenza. It infects 40% of the world's population with a mortality rate of 20%. Run those numbers today, another Spanish influenza event will kill hundreds of millions of people. And any biologic scientist will tell you we're due for another pandemic. So that's part of the security landscape we ought to consider. So as I wrap up this kind of frightening tale of woe, before I talk about what we ought to do about it, I would often get the question when I was the NATO commander, well, you know, Admiral, what really keeps you up at night? Is it Afghanistan, Syria, the Balkans, piracy, pandemics? What do you really worry about? The answer is I worried about cyber. Why? Because we are utterly dependent on this part of our civilization, increasingly. These are the flags of some European nations. That's Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia. What they have in common is that they were all attacked in the cyber sphere, which undermined fundamental elements of their society. And I'll give you a more practical example here in the United States. North Korea, this is the flag of North Korea, attacked Sony Pictures, a motion picture company, American company, after they produced this film. This is a terrible film, by the way. It is a movie that mocks the young leader of North Korea. He became angry, unleashed his cyber dogs, and did $300 million of kinetic damage to Sony Pictures. This kind of asymmetric use of the cyber world is something we need to worry about. And what are we most vulnerable? It's this, our electric grid. And let me illustrate as follows. If you went back to the early 20th century and you brought back to life two scientists, and you brought back Thomas Alva Edison. Actually, let's start with Alexander Graham Bell. You brought back Alexander Graham Bell. We all know Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, right? So you bring Alexander Graham Bell back and you hand him your iPhone, which Sandy correctly identified a few moments ago as Cornerstone, and you said to Alexander Graham Bell, look at this thing. It can communicate point to point anywhere in the world. You can listen to any piece of music ever played. You can watch films. You can take pictures with it. Alexander Graham Bell would have no idea what to do with this. Electric grid. Bring back Thomas Alva Edison, who harnessed electricity, right? If you showed Thomas Alva Edison our electric grid today, he would say, I can work on that. I can figure that out. We have not invested or made the advancements in our electric grid. And that's what I worry about in the cyber world. And then lastly on cyber, I'll make the observation that it's personal. It's deeply personal. Who is this? Jennifer Lawrence, beautiful, young, Academy Award-winning actress. 2 years ago, she took some, shall we say, intimate photographs of herself, intended to share with her person, 2 consenting adults, no problem. Unfortunately, she posted these photographs in a password-protected account in the cloud. You know, if she were my daughter, I'd probably say, Jennifer, you know, they call it the cloud, not the vault up there. Unfortunately, those photographs were hacked and widely distributed. Think about what that supercomputer you're carrying around in your pocket reveals about you. So cyber, which goes from the highest levels of our national infrastructure, through our finances, our credit cards, to our personal lives, we ought to worry more than we do, in my view, about cyber. So all this has a context. We have challenges in Europe because of Brexit, our strongest allies, our Europeans, kind of pulling apart with centrifugal force. And what's our problem here? It's gridlock. That's why I applaud 2 state senators from 2 different parties who come together and really solve problems. This is not what's happening in Washington, the solving of these problems. And all of it leads to this, a kind of a sense that the world is big and complicated and difficult. And why don't we just come home? Why don't we just build some walls? It's not going to work. Didn't work in the 20th century, and it's sure the heck not going to work in the 21st century. So right about now, you ought to say, okay, Admiral, I'm convinced. It's a complicated, difficult world. What do you think? What should we do about it? What are the opportunities to create better security? So I'll give you a couple ideas to think about, and I would argue that what you do here at the Council on International Relations of Santa Fe is fundamental to some of the ideas I'm going to put out there. So I'm a retired 4-star military officer. I'm proud of that. And you think the next slide is going to say, we need a big defense budget. Nah, we need a strong defense budget. But I'll tell you the first and most important thing we can do to create our own security is this. We can listen. Take a close look at that photograph. That man is listening. This is an early, believe it or not, this is not Photoshop. This is an early air defense system. When I went around Belgium as the NATO commander, I'd occasionally think, you know, that's probably still what Belgium is putting out there. But I put it here for us tonight as metaphor. We need to listen more. We need to understand the other culture, the other person, the other race, the other nation. That, I think, is most fundamental to what we should be doing. I think we also need to do what this photograph represents. This is the Naval College in Newport, Rhode Island. It's where the Navy sends its best and brightest to learn, to study, to build intellectual capital, which, of course, is exactly what you do here in the course of these marvelous events that you conduct over the course of the year. So we need to listen and we need to learn. And education is fundamental, and what you're doing is part of really lifelong education. What else? We need our values. We need our values. And our values come largely from the Western world. Socrates, that's Cicero at the top. Voltaire, that's the young Voltaire, the Enlightenment. Our own founding father, George Washington. You can drop a plumb line through these values to someone like Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, one of the great leaders of our time. So holding our values matters. What else? This one may surprise you. I would argue we ought to read more, but not just politics, economics, business, history. All that's important. I would argue we ought to read more novels. We ought to read more fiction. Why? Because by reading fiction, you can really understand another culture. You can put yourself in the shoes of the other. Here are a couple I've read lately. Bottom right, The Cartel, pretty close to New Mexico. This is about the drug wars in northern Mexico. The Sympathizer is about Vietnam. Waiting is a novel about China and its culture, etc., etc. The idea here is find time to read novels that unpackage other worlds for you. What else can we do? Languages. How many people here speak a second language? Wow, that's impressive. If I ask that question to a Department of Defense audience, 8%. 8%. The U.S. Department of Defense, 8% speak a second language. This is a Canadian corporal who is teaching himself Pashto while forward deployed in Afghanistan. That's the Rosetta Stone to the left. Santayana, the philosopher, said, to know another language is to know another life. We ought to be studying ourselves, but really encouraging our children, our grandchildren, to speak second languages. That's part of connections and building bridges. What other opportunities are there? I would argue our nation, the United States, remains an opportunity. I am not a triumphalist. I do not seek to portray the United States as the greatest country, nor do I think that we ought to be the world's policeman. But I do believe our country is not in decline. Upper left, political capital. Thank you. Look at that photograph. That's the G20. Those are the leaders of the 20 largest economies in the world. That's our president. Regardless of how you feel about our current president, the previous president, or our next president, regardless, look at that photograph. When the President of the United States speaks, there is real political capital deployed. Upper right, our economy is far from perfect, but as a hand of cards, despite our deficit, despite our debt, I would take our innovation, our structure, our geopolitical economic position over any other major economy in the world. Lower right, a strong, professional, and apolitical military. Bottom left, demographics. We're a young nation, and immigration helps us. And over the long throw of this century, it will continue to help us. And what's that in the center? That's a fracking tower, folks. Now, I get the environmental challenges. We got to do that right. But the United States is on a course toward real energy independence. When I put that together, it's a pretty good hand of cards. And so the question for us is, geopolitically, with whom do we partner? Where are our natural alliances in the world? And I'm going to start with one that may surprise you, which is this. It's India. India. This is the Golden Temple of Amritsar. It's sacred to the Sikh faith. India is the largest democracy in the world by a factor of 300%. In the last Indian election, 800 million people voted. 800 million people voted. Think about that. This is a nation with many challenges, But the natural connection between the world's oldest functional democracy, the United States, and the world's largest democracy is very powerful. We also ought to rely on our traditional allies like NATO. And it's not just formal alliances that are going to matter. Maybe we could stop opening that door every 30 seconds. It's not just these formal alliances that NATO are going to matter, but it's also coalitions. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. These kind of alliances are bridges that we build in the world. We cannot nor should we be the world's policemen, but we can be part of organizing a world that responds to real challenge. Do we still need a capable military? Yes, we still need a capable military. But I would argue our military will look a little different going forward. Now, this is another really terrible movie, Ender's Game. But it is an example of the need to think about cyber and how we build a cyber force to protect ourselves in this world. Alongside cyber, there'll be high-tech, unmanned vehicles, but the root of what will matter is right here. It's the young men and women who go forward to defend the country. This is Michael Murphy. Now, he was the subject of a very good film, and if you have not seen it, I recommend it. It's called Lone Survivor. This is about a Navy SEAL like Admiral Payne. Admiral Payne, I'm sure, knew Michael Murphy. I did. He died in 2008 in Afghanistan on a mission where he became the recipient of the Medal of Honor. And I put him here to remind us that with all the high tech, with all the cyber, with all the expensive systems, at the end of the day, it's all about men and women like Michael Murphy. He died in Afghanistan on that mission. Today, he sails, his spirit does, on that destroyer, USS Michael Murphy. That's fundamental to how we will create security. But we'll also find young men like this. In this debate we are having this year about immigration, let me introduce you to an immigrant. This is Alex Adichie, who came here on a boat in 2008 from Haiti and then went to West Point. You see him here, he's crying. This is 3 months ago at his graduation from West Point. He's crying tears of joy as he commissions as a second lieutenant, U.S. Army. He graduated at the top of his class at West Point. See all those stripes on his sleeve? He was the cadet commander of West Point. This is an extraordinary story. It's an immigrant story. And we ought to factor that into our thinking as we consider all of the debates we have this year. And again, people like Michael Murphy, you can drop a plumb line to people like Alex Adichie as well. So let me conclude with a couple other thoughts about our military. It's not just the hard power piece, which is critical. It is also the soft power side. This is a U.S. Navy hospital ship. It does medical treatments all around the world. When I was commander of Southern Command in Miami, this ship was part of my force. And I sent it all around Latin America, where wonderful doctors would do extraordinary medical treatments. And I went to an optometry clinic that we held on the ship in Nicaragua, where a young mother had walked for 3 days to come to this clinic. And she brought her son, and she said, he can't see anything in the distance. And the doctor quickly diagnosed it. He had simple myopia. And the doctor put glasses on the young boy. And he looked up, and all of a sudden he could see everything. He was 6 years old. And he said, Mama, veo el mundo. Mom, I see the world. Now multiply that by 400,000 patient treatments in a typical voyage of this ship. That creates real security for us, lasting relationships. I'll give you another example from Afghanistan. As the NATO commander, I went to Afghanistan every few weeks for 4 years. I've been to every province, every major city in Afghanistan. I took this photograph. These are Afghan police officers reading books. And you ought to say, boy, that's strange. You know, I thought I read somewhere that in Afghanistan a real challenge was that people couldn't read. Illiteracy, huge challenge. You'd be correct. Okay, so why are they reading books? The answer is this is literacy class. We're teaching them to read. Now there's guns in that picture, and we're teaching them to fight too because they're in the midst of battling a difficult insurgency. But this balance of soft power, of literacy, with the hard power, this is how we will create security most effectively in this 21st century. So I'll wrap up with one other thing I haven't mentioned, and then we'll open it up for some ideas and comments. We need to be here as well. And when I say here and you look at that, you're thinking, okay, retired Admiral, these are probably sea lanes of communication where big tankers go. Or maybe these are airline lanes, ICAO routes. Or maybe they're fiber optic cables under the ocean. Nope. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. Today on Facebook, billions of people connect. This is the largest bridge ever built. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is I'm also showing you a photograph of the command and control network of the Islamic State. These extremist groups are using these social networks, not just Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Roku, all of them, to proselytize, to recruit, and to command and control these operations. We need to be there. Why? Because our values can succeed in this world. Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, gender equality, racial equality. These are primal values. We execute them imperfectly, but they are the right values. We need to be in this world of strategic communications as well. That's the last idea I have for you when we talk about security. So let me conclude by showing you this, which is hard power. This is a Tomahawk missile being launched from a U.S. Navy cruiser. That missile is so accurate that we can fly it for 1,500 miles and decide whether it goes through that window or that door to take out that wedding party down there. Which we would not do. But that missile is hard power. And I would not want any of you to walk out of here tonight thinking that only soft power is the answer. Because I've talked a lot about soft power, right? Listening, languages, literacy training, medical ships, strategic communications, education, soft power. I believe in soft power, but you have to have hard power as well. Joe Nye, great Harvard professor, mentor of mine, has said, soft power without the ability to apply hard power is no power. That's right. The key is balance. It's not an on and off switch. It's not either hard power or soft power. It's about finding that balance between the two. It's a rheostat, not an on and off switch. So, as I conclude, and that's my last image, I'll stop with Wikipedia, which is a wonderful source of information, highly accurate. We don't allow students to footnote from it. Other than that, it's terrific. But I'll conclude with observing that Wikipedia is this extraordinary collection built by all of us. It's the greatest collection of knowledge in the history of mankind. And how's it assembled? It's not assembled by 12 really smart Harvard graduates locked in a closet somewhere. It's assembled by all of us. Every day, tens of thousands of people input into the wiki, and every day, millions of people draw that knowledge out. It is the perfect example of the fact that no one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together, building those bridges and breaking down those walls. So I'll conclude with the vision statement of Wikipedia, which is really simple. The vision of Wikipedia is a world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. A world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. My thesis for us is that by building bridges, by breaking down walls, by collaborating, by sharing and pooling our knowledge and ideas, together we can create the sum of all security in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.